Welcome to Dr. Bybee's Movement Medicine. Unfortunately, my regular assistant Fred is occupied today, so today I have student Dr. Amelia and internal medicine resident Dominique. Today we're going to be talking about how movement patterns, posture, and biomechanics can contribute to pain. And rather than going through a specific list of diagnostic maneuvers, such as the Hawking's maneuver for impingement, we're going to focus on the global assessment and not get distracted by the trees. We're going to focus on the forest here. Today, Amelia's been having some problems with shoulder pain, and we're going to start by doing a basic assessment, and we'll go from there. So, what's going on today?
Well, when I do any overhead activities, I get really bad left shoulder pain, just kind of like in this area, really deep into my shoulder.
Okay. So before we dive down our diagnostic pathway, we just want to take a quick look at how she's standing and how she's moving. So first things first, standing up more or less generally erect and upright. Go ahead and turn to the side and face me. So other things that I always want patients to pay attention to and clinicians to pay attention to is, do we have ears over shoulders over hips? If somebody had their neck really far forward, for example, that puts a lot of stress on the trapezius. Or a lot of us spend a lot of time with the keyboard and our shoulders are protracted and even more protract. Shoulders all the way forward, right? So then our shoulders are in front of our ears, placing a lot of stress on the traps, rhomboid, and neck. So once again, if we go ears over shoulders over hips, then that tends to protect the shoulder. The other thing that is a good cue is, can they pinch my fingers between their shoulder blades? Notice how that even resets her shoulders a little bit better. So protraction causes pain in general, and retraction relieves pain in general. So you said you have most of the pain when you're doing climbing and you have overhead exercises. So just go ahead and raise your hands overhead, just kind of without thinking. So she's got a little bit of elevation on the scapula. That's something to pay attention to. We are thinking about maybe turn around so we can see your back. Is it because her spine is not in line or she has scoliosis? So in this case, she does not, but something I want you to keep in mind. Very good. And then now the other thing I want you to try to do is raise your arms with your thumbs out very slowly, and just raise them up until you kind of can't keep your elbows straight and your thumbs out. Now turn your thumbs in, and can you pull your arms back even further? So what happens is that in external rotation, our latissimus is much shorter and we lose overhead range of motion. So if we need to reach something overhead, we'll instead do some internal rotation with our thumb. But as we talked about earlier, if your thumb is internally rotated, that impinges the humerus into the acromion, which is rotator cuff impingement. So if we have tight lats and we have our thumbs out and we want to do overhead exercises and we're missing some range of motion here, we'll accidentally compensate with internal rotation, but this compromises our rotator cuff. A lot of upper and lower extremity complaints are related to the back. Back pain's a whole other thing, but as we talk about global biomechanics, one thing I want to cue you into is relative rib cage and hip posture. If you're able to raise your arms a little bit in front of you, Amelia. So she has a lot of lumbar extension, and then drop your arms again. And it's hard to see with these scrubs on, but she's having some rib cage flare. Probably because she does a lot of studying, which means she's sitting, which means her psoas is very tight. So when our psoas is tight, it causes some anterior pelvic tilt. And then in order to maintain shoulders over hips, she's got to get some thoracic extension, causing some flare in her rib cage. What does it feel like instead? And what would it look like if you were to tense your core all the way around to pull your rib cage down into your hips. Notice immediately what happened is her hips shifted to a more level position. At the same time, can you think about standing on the blades of your feet? There you go. And doing that little external screw of the legs helps to pull your pelvis into a neutral tilt as well. So thinking about standing on the blades of your feet, just barely touching the big knuckle, keeping your pelvis flat, little bit of core engagement, then ears over shoulders over hips, you're not going to be having those tight hip flexors and tight lower back. Working from the ground up, let's start with the most important part of our structure, the arch of the foot. Dominique here has perhaps some congenital flat feet, which may or may not be a problem. But again, when we're thinking about people with ankle, knee, or back pain, where we contact the ground is going to determine how the rest of our system responds. Many times I see people with flat feet also have a little bit of ankle restriction. So if you could do that feet together squat, keeping your heels on the ground, can we get knees in front of toes? And then turn towards the camera if you wouldn't mind. Same thing. When we do this, notice how his knees collapse a little bit as we are losing some arch in the foot. Now, what happens if you're able to stand as much as possible on the blades of your feet? There you go. And notice how the knees come in line with the big toe. So a lot of medial knee problems happen when the arches collapse again for me, and boom, look at what happens to the knees. So if we can engage our glutes to bring the weight onto the blades of the feet, then we'll notice that the knees are over the toes, and this is very good biomechanics. It can save a lot of knee strain. So once again, from the front, we want to think about feet being a fist or two apart, and then we want to stand on the blades of our feet and gently touch the big toe down, and that's how you know that you've got good leg posture. Many people are either going to stand duck-footed, if your toes are all the way out, yeah. And see what that does to the knees? Now the knees are inside of the ankles, and that puts a lot of pressure on the MCL. And then we're going to have bad biomechanics when we walk. Feet are in contact with the ground, and they are the root of all of our power, and we love to punish them. If you come look at my feet, I've got a pretty nasty bunion on my left foot because I've got pretty bad arches that I ran hundreds of miles on when I was a teenager and young person. Unfortunately, most of the shoes that we wear have an elevated heel and a narrow toe box. So when we have an elevated heel, that means we're just shortening our Achilles tendon every time that we take a step. And then with a narrow toe box, go ahead and stand on your shoes. She's got compression socks on, so it's going to give a little bit of a misinterpretation. But when we stand, notice how the toes like to spread out, whereas shoes tend to compress the toes, which is why I prefer a wide toe box shoe, so that as I stand, my feet can grip the ground and not get compressed in the toe box, which takes away some of the mechanical advantage and sensitivity that we need in order to move well and pain-free. Walking. Who would have thought that we need classes in walking? But one thing I see a lot in patients is if we lose our ankle flexibility, every time we take a step, since we can't roll our knees over our toes, we're going to step our toes a little bit to the outside, then our knees are going to collapse, and then we're going to walk duck-footed. So whenever somebody is complaining of knee pain or back pain, I like to do a quick walking assessment and see are they able to walk with knees over toes and keep everything more or less in a straight line, or do we end up either duck foot or pigeon foot? as we're assessing somebody's pain, we want to just look at how they're moving. Many times, the pain is not the problem. It's just the weak link in a kinetic chain that's disorganized or dysfunctional. So why don't you go ahead and just do a band row, like you're trying to do a row. Okay? So there we go. So now instead, what I want you to focus on is put your pulling leg just a little bit behind your other leg. And then as you start the pull, retract your scapula and then begin your pull and rotate your thumb to the outside and pull your elbow into your hip. Now, this is a much stronger position because he has his lats engaged, his obliques engaged, and he's pulling the tension into his hip so that all of the power is connected through his hip, as opposed to start from the beginning and just do a pull again kind of blindly without thinking. Right? We do a lot of pulling from the shoulder, and we're not doing any engagement with the hip. So many times people will have elbow or shoulder pain because they're blindly reaching with poor biomechanics instead of coupling the force to their center of mass. We want to make sure that we can pull and push. And same thing with pulling. We want to organize the shoulder connected to the hip for best outcomes. So most people, when they're doing their bench press, they'll have their elbow high into the outside. And you see, you once again got that shoulder protracted. So what happens instead if, as you reset, you pull your elbow into your side, pinch your shoulder blades back together, and then before you even step forward with your right foot here, and then before you even begin to push with the band, can you tension it with your hips? There you go. And then as you push, keeping your elbow in at the side, you've got tension through your arm, once again, into the obliques and lats, and you're pushing with your whole body as opposed to just pushing with your shoulder. Once again, saving the rotator cuff from impingement, which happens a lot for people who do a lot of bench pressing with the bar up near their clavicle instead of at their nipple level. The human body is a series of whips and springs. We're not levers and hinges. And so we build up kinetic energy by storing energy in the spring of our muscles and releasing it like the crack of a whip. So as we saw demonstrated here with throwing, we can either push the ball like a shot put, which even then is not great because a shot put can still be a whip and a spring, or we can think about trying to get the velocity of our fingertips moving as fast as possible by building up tension, launching our center of mass with our back foot, using a snap of the hips to follow a snap of the shoulders, and at the very last second, passively coming along for the ride is our hand in the ball. Running is another example of a whip and a spring. Most of us, when we run, we're wearing Nikes with a very thick heel cushion, and we do a heel strike. But if you ever watch somebody run barefoot, especially a professional, what you're going to notice is that as they drive off their back foot, they are putting internal rotation through their hip, which snaps the hip, which then drives the knee up, and then the foot will snap out, and you're going to gently reach to the ground with your toes. So once again, the whip and a spring of running rather than a clomp, which puts a lot of stress through the ankle, knee, hip, and lower back. Hip flexors. What the hell are those? Who told me about those? Nobody, ever. They are the leading cause of back pain, in my opinion. And we do a lot of sitting here in the United States, and keeping our hips in this position chronically is a bit like grabbing all your pants and a big wad in your hips and trying to stand up. You get stuck there, and it's just like, ugh. I do it all the time, so you're not alone. So Amelia here has a similar issue. She does a lot of studying and therefore a lot of sitting. So if we keep our back leg as straight as possible, how low can you get in a lunge? So she's generally pretty flexible, but again, we're noticing some rib cage flare here because her hip flexors are tight, so she's compensating for a lower back. But this is my favorite both test and exercise to help with tight hip flexors. And so being able to keep a straight leg lunge and drop down as far as possible, knees over toes. Can you bring that knee over your toe? There you go. While tightening your rib cage so that you've got a strong back. And having patients work this exercise will help increase hip flexor length and strength and relieve back pain.
Oh, ouch!
Tennis elbow. Oh, so common, even for those of us who don't play tennis. What we notice most of the time with elbow pain, be it either medial or lateral epicondylopathy or epicondylitis, is a lack of external rotation. So, Amelia, would you demonstrate some external rotation for us? Like, how far out can you pull your hands while keeping your elbows at your side? So, for example, if you were doing a lot of swinging, mimic a swing, you can see how there'd be a lot of tension on the elbow as she moves through the range of motion. And so if we have a disorganized shoulder and if we're using our arm instead of our body, so then so push your hand against my hand, like you're trying to close the door. So good. You actually instinctively went to good posture. You've got a little bit of bend in the elbow and you're engaging your core to bring your hip into it. Whereas instead, you do it like that with a straight arm. See, immediately you want to bend because you know that this is the weak link in the chain. But many times we're doing 1,000,004 activities, putting stress on the medial elbow because we're not connecting the point of action with our own center of mass. So again, if you're having a lot of elbow pain, notice that when you push against some resistance, are you engaging your whole body? A little bit more scapular retraction, a little bit more elbow into your hip, pull your elbow into your hip, and then you can see that you can push a lot more weight this way than with your arm out there, which compromises the elbow.